Hey guys, just waiting for our guest pastors to arrive. So the book that we are going to be discussing is by Dr. Douglas Farrow called Theological Negotiations. And yeah, I hope that you enjoy. We should be starting shortly. Okay, it doesn't say that I'm alive yet, but let me see. Oh, good, so it is working. Yeah, I can see it over there. Oh, good, so it is working. Oh, hello. Hi, Pastor Adam. How's it going?
Hello.
You can hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear
Okay,
you.
awesome. All right. And I think we got Pastor Karl here too. He's just joining in.
Excellent.
Okay, I got to ask my ad hoc moderator if the sound's working. How are you doing, Pastor Karl? Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah. All right. I had a generous friend to moderate the audio for me to see if we have sound on both ends on Facebook and for us. So, yeah.
Playing glasses roulette here.
Oh, yeah, I'm
Probably
sure.
have to just switch to my reading glasses. Like the phone is right in the sweet spot where I don't need any glasses.
Right. Yeah.
So
I'm uh
glasses just
I'm kind of using this cheap webcam on my desktop that I got from Amazon, and so my resolution's a little bit low, but yeah, it looks like everything's working pretty well.
I'm just using my phone.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm using my laptop.
yeah.
I've been trying to get technology into my church since I've been here. So we have a new webcam and everything, and with tinkering with it, discovered that the programs to try and actually hook it up to the laptop aren't working properly.
Okay.
So
I'm getting from my moderator that he says he's having he says he can't hear anything on his phone. So I'm gonna. Oh, here we go.
Oh, here we go.
Okay. Can you hear anything?
Okay,
Can you
can you
hear
hear
something
anything?
now,
Can you hear
Greg?
something now, Greg?
It'll be a bit of a
It'll be a
delay
bit of a
because
delay because
he's a bit behind.
he's a bit behind.
I realized that one of
I
my
realized that one of my
audio things was muted.
audio things was muted.
All right. Just give a sec. Okay, so yeah, so
Yeah.
how
So
has
how
ministry
has
been going
ministry been
with
going
COVID?
with
You know,
COVID?
I
You
guess
know,
that must be a
I
big
guess that must be a big
adjustment.
adjustment.
We're all televangelists now.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
well,
So
Okay,
so
cool.
it says that
So
it's
so
working.
it
So
says
why
that
don't
it's working. So why don't
we all
we
introduce
all
ourselves?
introduce ourselves?
So
So
maybe I'll go
maybe I'll
first.
go
So my
first.
name
So my
is
name
Jonathan
is
Quist,
Jonathan
and I'm
Quist,
actually
and
a
I'm actually a
former
former
seminarian for the
seminarian for
Archdiocese of
the
Edmonton.
Archdiocese of
I'm still kind
Edmonton.
of like
I'm still
in
kind of like in
discernment for
discernment
seminary,
for
but
seminary, but
my
my
formation's kind of been
formation's kind of
delayed
been delayed
with COVID, and
with
so I'm just
COVID,
kind
and
of
so
trying
I'm
to
just
figure
kind
out
of trying to figure out
what's next.
what's
There's a
next.
few
There's a
groups that
few
are still kind of
groups that are still
offering formation,
formation,
and there are still some
and
guys
there
for
are still
Edmonton,
some
but
guys
it
for
just
Edmonton,
didn't
but
end
it
up
just
working out for
didn't
me.
end up working out for me.
But why don't you go next, Pastor Adam?
Pastor Adam.
Oh, okay. So I am Pastor Adam Chandler of Hope Lutheran Church here in Victoria, BC. I have graduated seminary in May.
Wow.
So this
Yeah.
is a fresh new call.
Great.
Right.
I came here just in time for when in-person services got started back up. So ministry during COVID is almost all I know, except for my vicarage, which was in a much better time.
Yes. Yeah. I can imagine.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Oh, and I should mention, I'm a member of Lutheran Church Canada.
Okay. Great.
Okay. Great.
Between the different Lutheran bodies, because there will be some minor differences that might pop up, probably not, but just in case.
Never.
Well, I'm sure that they will
I'm
actually
sure that they will
once we get to the
once
chapter
we
on
get to the chapter
justification.
on
I don't think we're going to get
justification. I
there
don't think we're gonna get
yet
there
this turn,
yet
but I mean,
this
because I
turn,
know
but
that
the
the Missouri Synod branches of the Lutheran Church didn't actually end up agreeing with the Joint Declaration of Justification in 1999. I don't know if you read about that. Yeah. Did you know that? Do you know about that, Pastor Adam? Or?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
well I know of it.
Yeah.
I haven't gone through the documents with a fine-tooth comb to figure out exactly why we didn't agree.
Yeah.
But I know basically that the conservative Lutheranism of Lutheran Church Canada and the Missouri Synod, to which we are a sister synod,
Right.
agree with how the Roman Catholic Church understands justification.
Right. Of course. Yeah.
I need to start discussing chapter 3.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Well,
Okay.
the truth is, if we go, I mean, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, because we should probably leave that for chapter 3, which
Yeah.
I, by the way, have not read yet.
Yeah.
Because I had been powering through the book, but back when we signed on to it, and I was a member of the ELCA, I should introduce myself first. Karl Johnson.
Right.
I've been a pastor, Lutheran pastor, for 27 years now, I guess.
Wonderful.
So I'm the old guy in the group. I'm with the North American Lutheran Church now, but most of my ministry was with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. And at the time we signed it, it was kind of interesting because what we really agreed on, we agreed that we almost agreed, but didn't quite agree, especially on the main points of division that go right back to the Reformation. It was almost like we agree that we still don't agree, but we agree to not make as much of it as we once did, something like that anyway. But there you have it.
Yeah, that's what I thought was going on in the document, but I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah. I mean, the basic problem still remains. I think what we decided is that maybe it isn't as church dividing as a problem as was supposed at the time of the Reformation and the Council of Trent.
Right, of course. So my mic is apparently reverberating because I'm still trying to learn how to stream here. So I think I have two
inputs. Okay, now I'm gonna ask my moderator. Can you hear me now, or have I just completely cut out now, Greg? Do you hear me? My friends here still hear me, but it's whether it's on the stream or not. Sorry, in the future episodes, this will go a lot smoother because I'll have everything figured out.
Yeah, bringing in technology to my services and devotions and whatnot, I found that it's very much a process of trial and error. So,
I know, of course.
I've been doing this for weeks now, and there's still things that I want to tune up and can't quite get.
Oh yeah, well. Oh, good. Okay, so my reverberation is good, and so we are good to go. Okay, so yeah. So does anyone want to jump in and talk about their kind of reaction to this first chapter, I guess so we can frame it for anyone who's listening. So the first chapter, to my understanding, was largely about kind of the relationship about philosophy and theology. So, what was your reaction to it?
Oh, Jonathan's frozen. Oh, there he's back.
Oh,
yeah, we missed the last bit of your statement, or I did anyway.
Oh, I was just asking. So, what was your reaction to Dr. Farrow's his assessment on the relationship between philosophy and theology?
I can go first. I actually I enjoyed reading it. I find him he's a fairly articulate, fairly clear writer, and that is not always easy in dealing with the subject matter at hand. I appreciated his use of juxtaposing Kant versus Barth versus Thomas as kind of as it were three ways of looking at the problem, I guess. He made some cursory references to Luther, but he doesn't get very deep into it. I worried a little that there was maybe going to be a tendency to conflate Luther with Barth. Or you might say Lutheranism with Reformed theology, which is a constant battle, a tendency to read Luther through Calvinist eyes, which I think is a mistake. But having said that, you got to start somewhere, I guess. I did appreciate, especially, and I should full disclosure, I'm not a philosophy guy. I haven't studied very much philosophy, studied a bit in, you sort of have to study a bit of philosophy when you study theology. You can't get around it. So it was fun kind of delving back into Kant a little bit, and just being reminded of all of that. Especially, it strikes me how much of the current debate from the new atheists, for instance, the bit that I get of it anyway, trying to find a basis of morality apart from the notion of God, how much it really is just plowing over the same field that Kant plowed over back then. And very much struck by, Kant's final conclusion was that one needed to live as if there was a God in order for there to be a basis of morality. And how much interesting how that mantle has been picked up most recently by Jordan Peterson. That's kind of where he ends up. And he remains on that side of the Kantian divide. Like he's not ready to say there is a God, but they kind of have to live as though there is a God. And I found that interesting because it articulates, I think, in some ways, the basic, one of the problems with Thomistic theology that Luther was trying to put his finger on. I heard it described once as that what Thomas is trying to do is taking Aristotelian categories and use them to lay them as a template over Christianity to find those points of agreement between philosophy and theology, which is a project I would not throw all the way out the window like Barth does.
Right.
But I would say it is limited. I heard it described once as that Thomas is forever trying to find a way to shoehorn Jesus into those categories. And I think that Farrow picks up on that. He picks up on that and kind of is a bit critical of Thomas for not letting Christology speak quite as much as one would think would be necessary in a Christian theology. So
especially in the second chapter, he really gets into that, because that is actually admitted. Like I've studied a fair amount of Thomistic theology, and he does kind of pick up on one of the weakest points of Thomas's theology, which is the state of the separated soul, because he's trying to maintain that the human existence is basically a composite of matter and form, and so when death occurs, the matter is separated from form, and so how can you actually have a state of separation where we are form and somehow are in union with God, but we can still kind of like function as humans in this kind of time of beatitude before we receive our bodies in the general resurrection. So yeah, it's a really difficult point for Thomas, but and ultimately I think he would admit that it is mystery, but it's yeah. What about
I think
you,
I would say
Pastor?
Thomas.
Go ahead.
Thomas would ultimately admit that things are mystery, but he would always do so grudgingly.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, he does have like the most quoted person that Thomas actually cites is actually Dionysius or pseudo Dionysius, whichever academic theory you choose to follow, and he does actually admit, at the base level of God's transcendence and our inability to understand, and even before Thomas was that fourth, he would acknowledge the consensus of the Fourth Lateran Council, which says that to the amount that we can know God, the similarity that we can associate with God, the dissimilarity is greater. And I think actually Dr. Farrow quotes that very part of the council in I think in the first chapter. Yeah. What about you, Pastor Adam? What were your first thoughts?
Well, I will probably preface this with, I actually started out more as a philosophy guy than a theology guy.
Oh, cool, yeah.
Back in this high school, when I was still trying to solve existential problems, among other things, I ended up delving fairly hard into philosophy. And once I found Kant in my undergraduate degree, I kind of delved into that. So Kant takes up about a shelf and a half in my library.
Wow.
However, I am kicking myself that I forgot to grab a book or two to bring with me to my office here. So I can't have any offhand references right now. Now, for me, I found it fairly interesting how Farrow kind of approached this, in the sense that he defined philosophy in the Greek sense, but then was comparing Kant to it. And German philosophy of Kant's day was not defining philosophy as, say, the love of wisdom or that kind of pursuit. And they were looking more at Weisen or Wissenschaft, which was looking more at philosophy in terms of knowledge or structure of knowledge. So for the German thought, or early modern German philosophy, it was an all-encompassing thing. So you're approaching all your thought in philosophy. Philosophy was how you came to understand all things. So when you're juxtaposing philosophy with theology at that point in time, theology gets put into a subcategory because theology is the structured knowledge of the revealed faith.
Sorry,
so
can you repeat that? That broke up. That broke up. Pardon me, Adam, would you mind repeating that? That broke up. Did you say the philosophy is the structure of knowledge of revealed faith?
Oh, no. So philosophy is basically the hermeneutic by which you understand all thought.
Yeah.
So theology.
Yeah, in particular, the definition of theology was where you dropped out. Would you mind just repeating that?
So theology would have been considered a subcategory of philosophy insofar it is the structured, systematic outline of revealed thought.
Of revealed thought. Okay, that's what I thought you said. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So Kant was using Baumgarten's metaphysics text to basically outline all his courses, how he thought about metaphysics. And theology came in as the fourth part of metaphysics. So start with ontology, the basics of being. Then you go into cosmology, how being becomes the universe. Then you go into psychology, how that comes the soul, you. And then what is the relation to the soul to the rest of reality? And then you go into theology, going outside of the self. So in that way, Kant was distancing himself from Descartes, because Descartes was himself a staunch Catholic. Although you can kind of debate that a little bit, but I always see him as a fairly staunch Catholic. Descartes was trying to say the basis of thought is rationality, but it also includes God. Because, well, basically God is there and you come to know things by God, and he brings you revelation through your senses and brings you beyond yourself. So the only things you can know for sure is logic and God. Kant kind of does away with that, and I won't go through the whole philosophical arguments why, but essentially what he's trying to do is he's trying to establish the basis of thought, which is within the self. So when we come to basically late 18th century, early 19th century philosophy, it's Wissen, knowledge, structuring it, Wissenschaft, structure of knowledge. And when you're trying to structure the knowledge, theology kind of goes by the wayside. And that's more or less Kant's point in the conflict of the faculties that Farrow is referencing quite often. Because Kant was not arguing that there are high faculties that seem to dictate everything. He was trying to say, no, philosophy has been put aside, whereas it should be the arbiter of all the rest of the faculties. But it is how you structure thought and how those faculties do their business.
Right.
And so he's basically hardlining revelation one side, philosophy to the other side. So when Kant is talking theology, he's talking philosophy, not necessarily, which I think is one of the issues I had with the first chapter and how how Farrow was trying to present this.
Well, I think that's actually that kind of gets to the heart of the matter of that chapter, because by creating a hard line between theology and philosophy, it kind of departs from the tradition of those two sciences informing each other, of philosophy being, the handmaiden of theology. So it's, but and that tradition actually is, is quite ancient. Like there's a chapter of that in the Schemata by Saint who was it again? Let me just pull this up. It was by Saint Clement of Alexandria in the in the late 2nd century, and so it's and so that was always a precedent in the early church fathers, unless you kind of go down the line of someone like Tertullian, who said, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? But they used philosophical reasoning to be able to kind of come to a deeper understanding of how we can understand and categorize revelation. But I guess my initial thoughts on it were that was pretty interesting. I thought that there was the distinction between Kant and between Barth, I think, is kind of a little bit of a fallacious one, because Kant really isn't a proper theologian, as you pointed out. He only has kind of theology as sort of a subheading of philosophy. I mean, I guess Schleiermacher would probably fit into that category a little bit more, but I don't think there's that many people who consider themselves to be Orthodox Christians who take Schleiermacher that seriously, since he basically only just kind of reduces revealed theology to sort of a emotional sentiment, which is kind of funny though, because Kant, if if my philosophy 101, is serving me well, really wanted to maintain objective morality through his sort of epistemology, through his categories. But then Schleiermacher kind of goes into this theological direction at the coattails of Kant in a way that just almost kind of goes into basic theological relativism. Like, he actually denies the Athanasian consensus as being essential to Christianity. That that God is three persons, and one God, and that he actually falls almost more into a more of a like a Sabellianist model, where he's like, or modalism, that the three persons, are different, like, kind of expressions of the one God. And so he kind of goes like anti sort of doctrine. But it's interesting that he would develop that from the philosophy of a person who was trying to be, morally objectivist. But yeah.
How much of just back to Kant for a moment?
Yeah, sorry.
Adam, you could probably answer this, because you seem to know definitely more than I do about any of this. But I've always had the sense that Kant, along with a lot of other people, that one of the mistakes that they make is when they talk about theology, they seem to think of it as though morality is the proper end of theology. That seems to be
right.
the fixation. And of course, as a Lutheran, well, it's not that we say morality doesn't matter, but we wouldn't see that as the telos, right? Is that a fair assessment of Kant, to suggest that that's really, that when he talks about theology, his real project is morality, and that maybe a distinction would need to be made there?
I think I would need to actually get into some of Kant's correspondence to try and figure out any of his particular motives.
Right.
But from his work on the only possible way to demonstrate the existence of God, I'm missing the title in my head for what he's trying to do in that work, along with some of the subsequent works on morality, was he was trying to find a way that morality could operate in the universal. Kant was basically, he wasn't necessarily assuming morality was objective, but that was an underlying premise to how he was exploring it. For Kant, since all people seem to have some sort of moral reasoning, he was arguing that there is something objective called morality affecting all people. And when he was...
Go ahead. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
And from there, he was trying to stem out towards, well, how do we come to be moral in larger and larger groups? And it's the basis of morality. So how Kant was defining morality and how we actually act morally, he was finding that we need to have some sort of accountability in our moral operations. Otherwise, there is no reward, there is no punishment. Therefore, morality lacks an object. So morality must have an object, which for all intents and purposes have to be God, because that would be the only way to do that. However, Kant is operating within purely rational thought, not necessarily revelation. His construct of God within this argument is not flushed out, and Kant would readily admit that. Because what ends up happening is he comes into what's called the kingdom of ends. So when you're trying to act for the telos, the moral theological ends, you're finding yourself needing somebody to orchestrate all of this across all humanity, across all of existence, and that would be God. So you need a perfectly moral being that would do this. So it's not necessarily that Kant was trying to develop a God as an answer to morality, but that through his study of morality, he found God. And this would be the God of the philosophers, not revealed God. And I don't know if we want to get into that now, but that kind of deals with all the Occamist philosophy and noumenal realm. And I assume we're going to get that into this later in the conversation, so I'll leave that.
Well, yeah, I think that it's it does kind of touch upon this point that I really wanted to go down, which is I think like that there is like I think that that with Occam and subsequently with Luther, there is more and more of a divorce between faith and reason. Is that a fair assessment? You'd been to Lutheran pastors that there is kind of or at least a suspicion when you try and use reason in its relation to faith that eventually, that ultimately it'll fall flat, or is it? How would you summarize? We're talking more about we were talking more about Barth than Luther. But how would you summarize Luther's summary of reason and its relation to faith?
Just as a cursory thing, I would say it's something like this. I feel like it's not exactly accurate to say that that Luther or Lutherans, because of course Luther was always all over the place. He'd say one thing at one time and another thing at another time. He was not a systematic theologian. He was more of a contextual theologian. He would seem to contradict himself by times. I mean, that's Luther. So sometimes when he spoke very strongly against reason, I think there's a tendency to think he was throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And sorry, I'm getting some kind of a notice.
Yeah, I guess there's like usually a 40-minute time limit. But
I think it's more like this. I don't think Luther thought, and I would not know what to cite to say this, but it's my general sense. Luther didn't say that reason has no place or anything like that, but that we ought not to treat reason as though it's not fallen. And I think that that's one of the problems is we sometimes speak of reason or the rational soul as though reason sort of exists out there as a pure thing that we can access. And I'm not suggesting it doesn't, because I think that understanding logos as reason is at least it's something that one could talk about, that it's an aspect of it. But we are fallen humans, and so any attempt we make to approach reason is also going to be fallen, right? There's an old saying, I don't know who said it, but it said the problem with it's either the problem with insanity or the problem with evil, could be either, is not that it's illogical, but that it's only logical. If you start from a faulty premise, you can follow a rational path to a faulty conclusion, but the path itself will be rational. So one of the things that I made notes, I found myself making notes all through the first chapter. I would just keep saying Nazism, 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 right? Because the Nazis, I just finished reading a book a while ago. It's called The Black Earth, and it's about some of the philosophical, spiritual underpinnings of Nazism. And they made the case, the Nazis were making the case that they were approaching politics in a scientific and rational manner, and that they were approaching humanity, anthropology, the way that people live and ought to live with one another. The morality that they espoused was one that they claimed was scientific and rational, based upon things like the survival of the fittest. So there we start getting some of the race theory, right? The fittest race will dominate the other races. After all, is that not the way that nature works? Now, I'm not suggesting it's right, but I am suggesting that it is in one sense rational. And that if you were going to come up with a vision of God based entirely upon observation of nature, it might be a very different looking God than the Judeo-Christian God, which I hold has to come by revelation or be supernatural, because there are things that we say about God that one would never derive from nature. Things like mercy, for instance. You might find examples of something approaching mercy in nature, but nature tends to be relatively merciless. I think that it would tilt the other way. So I think that this is one of the problems. If we were going to look at the Enlightenment, there were those Enlightenment thinkers who basically were taking a Judeo-Christian worldview and morality that had been built up over centuries, and they were treating it as though it were a self-evident truth that could be apprehended by reason alone. And I think that maybe you might even say, I know Luther predated the Enlightenment, but maybe Luther's critique of some of that might have been like an early critique of the limits of reason. That's not to say that reason is limited by the people who employ it, and the people who employ it are all sinners. So it's a long-winded answer, but that's kind of more the way I see it. He didn't say that reason had no place at all, but that too much was being made of it, I guess. Does that make sense to anyone but me?
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. And I think we're getting kind of more to the heart of the matter of this chapter, especially when you're talking about the relationship between grace and nature. That's one of the things that Barth really rejected about St. Thomas's philosophy, is that he had this whole structure where he believed that grace was built upon nature, that grace, and he quotes it in Latin, that gratia non tollit sed perficit naturam, so that grace does not destroy, nature, but perfects nature. Yeah.
I would actually like to build off of Pastor Karl's, well, kind of even the tangent was something that I wasn't thinking about, but is actually very relevant to the conversation. With the idea of morality being completely rational. That was how it was presented in the Enlightenment, with most notably the Enlightenment thinkers in France at the time. Later, the German philosophers really did that. That was all of what Kant was writing about. And when you're coming with a completely rational philosophy for morality, well, it makes sense, and you can demonstrate it to make sense. But when you actually try to employ a completely rational theology, rational morality, it runs into problems. The reason why Kant was going more towards rationality in terms of morality was because another philosopher, David Hume, of Scotland's Enlightenment movement, and also Hume was influenced by various other thinkers and also influenced other thinkers. So the British Isles created a view of morality as sentimentality, where morality is coming from emotions. So the continent was trying to go the other way and say, no, it's completely rational. So where do you find completely rational people who are isolated from emotion? Well, these would be quite literally psychopaths. And when people with psychopathic tendencies, they are thinking completely rationally, but when they violate moral principles, they do so because they don't care. They don't feel empathy. They don't.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you run into problems if you try to operate purely rationally. The emotional component. And that's completely rationally. We will still fall into our sinful tendencies. So what Luther was trying to present, and I was, while you're talking, I was pulling up some of my old notes.
Cool, yeah.
You have the famous Luther quote, "But since the devil's bride, reason, that pretty whore, comes in and thinks, and what she says, what she thinks is from the Holy Spirit, who can help us then?" Yeah, Luther basically saying, yeah, reason is the devil's whore.
Right.
But
well, I've heard. Oh, go ahead.
Place,
yeah,
he will say, oh, sorry. Yeah, in another place, he says, so it is with human reason, which strives not against faith when enlightened, but rather furthers and advances it. So he's basically trying to juxtapose a reason coming purely from humanity versus a reason that is driven by the Holy Spirit in light of the scriptures that can help inform us of the scriptures and what God is doing through them. So it's more of a juxtaposition of saint versus sinner rather than trying to say faith versus reason.
Or if I could take another famous Luther quote, one that was having a discussion with a Catholic person at one time. I can't even remember who it was. It was many years ago now. And he made the case that it was actually a case that I kind of agreed with. He was talking about the Lutheran tendency to dismiss tradition. And I do agree that tends to be a weak point with some Lutherans anyway. But he said that, well, but Luther said that we could make all of these decisions based on conscience alone. And I said, no, that's not exactly true. That would, conscience, you might say, would be an analogy, an analog to reason, perhaps, in this sense. And I said, no, Luther spoke of a conscience held captive to the word of God. And that's the difference. A conscience not referring to the word of God could easily become the devil's whore as well. See what I mean? So I think that, Adam, I think that you're absolutely right about that. That is Luther's project, is that any one of these things, whether it be conscience or reason or emotion, with his critique of the Schwärmerei, not always going back to the word, to the revelation, is going to lead you astray, because each of these things employed by fallen humanity, without a reference to the one who isn't fallen, but to the one, that's not even right to say it that way, without going back to the source, can lead you astray. And it becomes a mistake to treat any of these things, including tradition, by the way, as somehow or other something which will always lead you to the truth and can't be knocked off the path by sin.
Yeah, I guess like where that leaves me is that the very conception that St. Thomas has about truth is just very fundamentally different than kind of the via moderna, and the way that truth is understood as being kind of separable. Like this has to do with kind of the difference between essentialism and nominalism. That nominalism, actually, it started even as early before the time of Aquinas, even back to the time of the 11th century. He talked about John Eriugena and Peter Abelard, and they were kind of these like early proto-nominalists, where the relationship between an idea, or sort of like a concept that I have, and the thing itself is just purely sort of like, constructive. Like it's just something that we create sort of in our language. And this is more a philosophical discussion. But Aquinas, coming back from like more of a classical philosophy, which a lot of early Christian fathers inherited, had this idea that universal categories, to an extent, and Augustine actually espoused this as well, have a relationship with the mind of God. So like Plato, you had this kind of idea of the world of forms, right? That there was that we see like like all these individual dogs, and they're always changing, and there's so many different types of dogs. So there must be a form, a perfect dog that exists in the world of form, and in our conception of that form, we're able to deduce and recognize various other dogs that kind of share in that essence or in that form. And so Augustine married that that world of forms kind of with kind of the mind of God, and so that the way that our reason is actually able to work is that it's actually enmeshed with our our rational nature, that that our reason in it to some capacity is united with God, who is ultimately the supreme truth. And so that whenever we have a limited understanding, especially through our sin and through our our fallen nature, but we are able to an extent understand something of that universal idea that exists in God. So it's not just reason isn't just my individual deductions and my logical analysis, that there is something objective that sort of precedes me when I'm able to make these inductions and have some understanding of the universal nature of things. Of course, it's we have to approach our understanding of universals with profound humility, knowing that we are just individual creatures, but that we can understand something of the divine order of creation through our reason.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that you're onto something there. The one caution that I would have would be something like this. The solution to a nominalist tendency to say too little about things is not to say too much about things. And that's where I think Aquinas and perhaps Aristotle before him had a tendency to want to jam everything into its own little pigeonhole and get everything organized in a nice, neat, tidy little thing, and sometimes ended up saying too much. But having said that, I do think that there's something like, okay, on to Barth for a moment. Like, Barth makes the mistake of reducing everything to revelation. The only, I mean, I'm caricaturing Barth probably here. The only thing one can ever know about God is through his revelation of himself in Jesus Christ. Well, it strikes me that if something couldn't be known of God by observation of nature, how could anyone have recognized God when he came in Christ? There must have been something there that twigged Peter to say, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." There must have been something which caused Moses to say, "Oh, look at that burning bush up there. That doesn't seem ordinary." So the fact that it didn't seem ordinary to him and was worth checking out meant that there was something going on that was beyond nature and supernatural, and he recognized it as supernatural. How did he know that there was even such a thing as supernatural? Except because he had observed nature. You see what I'm saying? That
sure, yeah.
I heard it said before that what can be known about God through observation of nature? Well, I mean, look at almost all the peoples of the earth have some notion of God. Almost all of the peoples of the earth, we could have a fruitful discussion about God according to the first article of the Creed. Almost every culture would agree with that, more or less. That God created, right? It's when we get onto the second article that I think that really absolutely needs to be revelation, and I would say the incarnational revelation in specific, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
But there kind of needs to be some evidence of God in creation before we would even recognize second article stuff when it comes. That's kind of how I see it anyway, but it's limited. And I do find Farrow does say that. He talks about to some extent, he uses phraseology like that quite a lot, which I think is good, but it is one of the things I always find maddening about Thomas. When I've tried to read him, is that he says things like, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole right now, but when we start talking about free will, for instance, or as Lutherans would say more properly, bound choice, the idea that say, well, we obviously, we hear we do have free will to an extent. which to me is just a more complicated way of saying our wills are bound, right? It's kind of like when people argue to me that the protests we've been watching recently are mostly peaceful. Well, mostly peaceful is another way of saying periodically violent. You know, I mean, so Thomas talks about, you know, to some extent, but then it's almost like he doesn't want that to be true sometimes. Whereas Bart goes the other way. It's like he doesn't want to see anything apart from the incarnational revelation, right? To which then it's like, so did all of the people who believed in God? I'll tell you what. I'll concede the point about the Jews if we take a Christocentric reading of the entire revelation to the Jews, or to the children of Israel. Okay, but what about all of the people who are outside of that revelation who still had some notions about God, which were at least in the right ballpark? God created.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
That can come from observation of nature. I think that the complexity of nature kind of nudges you toward thinking there must be an intelligence behind it.
What are your thoughts about that, Pastor Adam?
I was going to make the comment that, well, we would know who God is to some extent because what we read in Genesis chapter 1, that he places image inside of us. Now, through sin, that image has been shattered to some extent. We are no longer the perfect creatures we were in the garden. But through this, we can actually understand some sort of shattered image of God in his creation, among other things. So God did not create us to live in ignorance of him, but in relationship with him. We are the ones who receive the providence of creation. So we know that we are not complete in ourselves, but need something to have created us. This is also why the fourth commandment is so important. Honor your father and your mother, because that's telling you, well, that's where you come from. These are the ones who bore you, and to whom on earth you owe your allegiance, your submission. So when we find figures of God in creation, like our parents, we go, oh yes, we recognize that you have borne us. We recognize that from you we have come, and we owe you something. It's the law and not the gospel. And when we try to shift over to the gospel, which is more properly the second article of the creed than the first. There is some gospel in the first article of the creed.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, but when we go to the specifics, how we are saved, why we are saved, and how God does that in a loving and caring manner through the person of Jesus Christ, we need some sort of revelation. Bringing this back to our earlier conversation with philosophy, even with the nominalist versus essentialist, essentially how I understand philosophy, or at least Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy is a little outside my wheelhouse. Western philosophy is more or less a back and forth, in and out of emphasis on Plato and Aristotle. Plato is the one who's looking at the forms, that which is without definite essence, that we can think logically about, but it's not necessarily a physical aspect of it. Whereas Aristotle is the one who's going more empiricist route, where you're understanding things through evidence, and as you go through history, people are more interpreting that evidence in terms of physical reality. When you come to Kant, he's seeing these divergent streams of thought come out more so than they have been in the scholastic period, where we're kind of debating with Thomas. But at his point in time, he's getting the empiricists. Sorry, I was pointing this way for empiricism. The empiricists in the British Isles, and they're going hardline, you have to have some sort of physical reality to determine what is true. versus rationalists on the continent, which are going, we have to have some sort of logic, and that is the only way we know things are true. What Kant ends up doing is he intermarries them, intermarries empiricist and rationalist thought, breeds together Plato and Aristotle, and basically says we can go so far by reason, but we need some sort of empirical reality to verify our thought and also to inform our thought. That comes up to the matter of religion. Kant has very little to go on in terms of empiricist reality. Well, how do you prove such and such a thing was created by God without some sort of historical evidence to say this? There's revelation, and he will reference the Bible because he was growing up in a Christian community. But he was more interested in finding a surety of thought, which he went through a more rationalist way of thinking. And in his early years, he came up with the transcendental argument for the existence of God, that if you have any thought at all, it has to come from some sort of mind, at which point you have the one who transcends beyond the reality that you're in. So he came up with that. He later abandoned it in favor of the moral argument because he thought he had a sure thing. So something similar happens in this. Oh, sorry. No, I'll finish that thought. So what he ends up doing is he developed a distinction between the phenomenal realm and the noumenal realm. The phenomenal realm for Kant, phenomenology changes definitions in the next 100 years, but for Kant, it was looking into the empirical knowledge that you gather. So rather than the objects you perceive, the objects that you observe through your senses, you are understanding it only phenomenologically, meaning you only have the thoughts created by your senses. So insofar as the object you're encountering is not part of your own mind, is not part of your thoughts, but something that enters your thoughts through a medium, basically your senses, you can't say 100% sure what on earth is going on out there. So when God is out there and you have some sort of idea that he might be, but so far beyond the empirical reality that you can sense, Kant shies away from saying much at all. And he creates the idea of the noumenal realm. Well, you can't say absolutely everything about these objects. Something similar happens with scholastic philosophy, which kind of culminates in Occam and Luther. They're finding that there is an empirical reality that you can understand, come across, and try to think through. But the greater reality of God, which is so far beyond human reason, so far beyond our ability to conceive, that we cannot say 100% sure what's going on. So they get away from the essentialist arguments, which are saying, well, there's this perfect thing out there in the realm of forms or what have you. We can't say absolutely everything about that. So we will say something that is according to how we understand things, which is in our limited perspective. So they're not denying the realm of forms per se, although Occam, I don't know if he does. But what Luther is saying is we cannot say absolutely everything about God. I mean, we have limitations to our reason. We have the first article of the Creed, and we can say, oh, God created the heavens and the earth, and we can see all these things here, and God gives me body and soul, house, shoes, all the little things in the first explanation in his catechism. He's limiting that to what's known as the law, the response in the law. You receive something, now you have to give back. You have to do what God wants you to do. Not so much in the second article, when God is purely giving you something to go beyond yourself and come to God. And insofar as revelation is through that route, through the word, something God is giving us rather than something purely observable from our point of view, something that is coming to us and working within us to create faith. that we can actually say something about only by revelation.
Yeah.
So there has to be a balance between what you can experience by yourself and God is delivering directly to you.
Yeah, and I mean, like Aquinas and the Church have always asserted that, especially the mysteries of the Trinity and the Incarnation are strict addictive mysteries that they cannot be proved rationally, and that's always been doctrinally asserted throughout the history of the Church. And that is true. That's a given. The the big difference when you get to like Occam, and Occam actually could be argued to be still within the church tradition, but changes quite a bit of the emphasis in how God sort of determines like the order of creation that is purely focused on his will. He's an extreme like voluntarist. So the only reason why it's good and not evil to murder innocent people is because God created it that way. So it's almost kind of like the Islamic sort of like understanding of God's like sovereign will. So he focuses primarily on God's sovereignty rather than on these intellectual notions that we have and natural law, which in more of a Thomistic understanding, correspond with nature and correlate with our understanding of God. That there is kind of this rational order that God imbues in the universe that we can kind of that we can apprehend, just even through observing nature and through the natural law. Whereas, whereas Occam almost completely, denies that. He just says that there are these categories because God created it that way, and he said, and he could have done it another way. He could have made murder, like a moral imperative that you must murder, and just because he said it, then it was, and so it doesn't necessarily have to be rational in our conception of rationality, because reason is very subjugated to will in Occam.
Yeah, but you've also got to be very careful not to make God subject to reason.
Sure.
To make God subject to a sort of a dualistic understanding of good and evil, and well, God couldn't possibly do that because that wouldn't be good, and God has to be good. I haven't read any David Bentley Hart, but I got a friend who's like kind of obsessed with him. And David Bentley Hart is a Christian universalist, right? And as far as, I mean, and again, I wouldn't want to go up against the guy because he obviously has a very big brain. But it seems to me that if my friend is representing it correctly, I haven't read his book on universalism, but what it comes down to is, well, nobody's going to end up in hell for all eternity because that would make God bad, and God can't be bad. And it's just, as soon as I hear those words, God can't be, I start going, good and evil. I mean, I think that Occam, and I haven't read any Occam either, not really. But I take the point that when you start saying that God can't do this because it would be a violation of reason, well, then you've made reason God. All right.
Or you've said that in essence, our reason has a correspondence to God and God's creation, and that He's made us, such in His image, and that's how Aquinas argues that we are imaged in God's creation is through our rational nature, and that's kind of what. Yeah,
I agree, and I don't have a whole lot of patience with the arguments to say if God had wanted to do it another way, He could have, because it's an entirely academic argument. God did do things the way He did them for His own reasons.
Right.
They are His own reasons. That's the thing. That I believe these things need to be interpreted in relation to God. And if you don't say that everything always has to come back to in relation to God, you run into really thorny problems. Again, I mean, the one that, think of the ones, well, you guys haven't dealt with confirmation students for many years like I have. But they ask you really tough questions.
Yeah.
how do you explain God telling Joshua and the children of Israel to go in and effectively commit genocide?
Right. Yeah.
God do something bad there? Well, I guess it would seem bad to you if you're one of the ones who are being killed. But I have to say that somehow or other, if God said that it must be done, that it is in some sense good because
Right.
of that relationship to God.
Yeah.
Right. And I know that's a hard thing to it's a hard thing to have to accept. And so we come back to the question of how can a good God allow anyone to go to hell? And by the way, just full disclosure, I'm not willing to say that in the end God won't save everyone. In fact, I would say that I would hope and pray that it does happen. It will be through Christ, through his atoning work. But I'm not going to say that he's a bad God if he doesn't do it either. That's me saying too much, right? So people ask the question, how can a good God allow anyone to suffer eternal damnation? The way I've always answered that question is to say that we have the revelation of God in Christ. But the revelation that God has given us of the gospel must not be confused with the whole counsel of God. So sometimes we need to acknowledge that we don't have the answer to every question, but we do have the answer to some. And so the question of how can a good God allow anyone to go to hell? I would say that to some degree that is a question that we are not given the answer to, but we are given the answer to one that's similar to it in some ways. How can a holy and righteous God allow a sinner like me into heaven? Now that one I can deal with. The revelation has given me an answer to that. So to some degree, we need to approach some of these things with humility, with the humility that says our reason is limited. How can we decide that we are going to pass judgment upon God as to what is good and evil? Because our very notions of good and evil are fallen, like everything else. See what I mean? So I can agree kind of in principle that God won't. I don't like God can't go against his own nature. I prefer God won't go against his own nature. Though I do recognize I'm perhaps splitting hairs there. But yeah, sorry, I'm off in the weeds now. But you kind of see.
No, that's absolutely. I think that's totally relevant to the conversation. Because I think that is one of the big dangers of theology is to try and create God in our own image rather than recognizing that we are created in God's image. I think that's incredibly dangerous, and especially when people just deal, superficially with questions like the ban on the Canaanites and just say it was like, oh well, that was just like a historical time and warring tribes and they just try and historicize it. It's just like that doesn't. You're not really answering the question here, because this is something that that Christians have struggled with for centuries. They're not just it's not just because they were like more primitive people. It's so condescending to say, but I think that comes to a point that wasn't addressed in the book, that kind of comes from the Eastern understanding of theology, that a theologian is a person profoundly of prayer, of a person who seeks after God and actually tries to unite his will with him. Like there's this element of mysticism that's like that's inbound with the idea of theology. And it would be, and my uncle for a while was Orthodox. He was actually received into and chrismated into the Orthodox Church in Mount Athos. And he said to
Sig?
yeah, Sig, yeah. And we were talking about this just the other week, and he was saying it'd be profoundly blasphemous for a person to claim to be a theologian if he didn't go to church every Sunday, like in the Orthodox tradition. That just like it's not just like a discipline of intellect. That's just like that would be obscene in the Eastern mind. So I think that's something that didn't get touched in the book, but something that needs to be brought into consideration when we're talking about theology. Yeah. Do you want to jump in, Pastor Adam?
I don't know. Well, something that was kind of passing through my mind was essentially the heart of the chapter is, how do we come to know God?
Mm-hmm.
And how Farrow was presenting it was basically, do we go primarily reason in the form of the philosophers? Do we go only revelation like with Barth, or do we try to take some sort of middle route like Aquinas? And then we kind of miss some of, that's what Farrow's writing about. So I don't blame him for not taking into account other things, but if we're wanting to take into account other sources of knowledge to try and understand God, we would also include experiences. This would be interactions with God in worship services. This could even be, still have them. We also have tradition as something even separate from this, where we have all this knowledge and practice over centuries brought down to us so that we can engage with it. And we don't necessarily try to pigeonhole God in any one category.
Yeah.
And doing so is rather dangerous. The book of Job is my favorite book of the Bible. And,
excellent.
And I like that, and I came to like that because it is primarily a philosophical book. Because you have the prologue, which you have the revelation in heaven, and then for the next 35 chapters until God finally appears and starts talking to you, it's purely humans talking based on what they have already received, whether that just be rationality teaching, their own experiences, because also tradition, because the character Eliphaz, he's basically putting forward, it was Bildad who does this. Bildad is saying, do you think you're better than our fathers? Because this is the tradition that we have for generations. How dare you question this, Job? Zophar is kind of the more logical one. So he's going, well, A plus B equals C. So why on earth are you trying to do something else? And then I would kind of categorize Eliphaz more in the emotional, experiential category, because he has such a swing. From the beginning, he's trying to be very sympathetic, and then by the end, he's just condemning Job left, right, and center, just because he has such an adverse reaction to it. But what Job does is he's trying to synthesize what he knows and their conflicting opinions, or conflicting facts. So you have a perfectly righteous God, a righteous and blameless man, and you have this suffering. Well, how do these three things interact? If you get rid of one or the other, suddenly it all makes sense. Because if there's no God, then of course, no one anything. Then of course, righteous people will suffer. If you get rid of the righteous person, well, there's only sinners to suffer. If you get rid of God, well, if you get rid of the suffering, well, then you just have happy God, happy people. That's it. But when you have this conflicting thought, you don't necessarily know what's going on, and you're trying to make sense of it, and you realize that you can't. Even when God appears, he doesn't actually give you a specific answer as to why things are happening the way they are. And basically what God does is he presents himself.
Yes. Because what is it Job keeps saying through that whole section? He says it, I think, about 3 or 4 times. I love the book of Job. And Job keeps saying, in effect, if only I could get to talk to God face to face, I'd show him he's made a terrible mistake. Okay, so here's the most interesting thing. At the beginning of the book, you have Satan, the accuser. And God says to him, have you considered my servant Job? Go ahead and accuse him. Well, he can't accuse him. He says, well, he's only good because you protect him. All right, well, I'll let you go at him then. It's like all the while God knows there actually is a problem with Job, and he's just trying to get somebody to do their job and accuse him properly. And then finally, in the end, Job takes the place of Satan and accuses God by saying, if only I could talk to him face to face, I'd explain it to him. Right? And what does God do? He ends up taking the role of the accuser, in a sense, by saying to Job, where were you when I created the earth? You know what I mean? So it's like, I always get the feeling like God finally rolls his eyes at the end and says, I got to do everything in this scenario.
Yeah.
You know what? It's a brilliant book. I love that. I've never thought of it as a philosophical book.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That was my first thought when I was, first thought as a teenager as I was rereading it. I was like, yeah, this is philosophy. But with the theonomy, God's speeches, what I love about those is it's redirecting Job. Because Elihu, who pops up chapters 32, 37, he's in the role as the pastor, accusing Job with the law and then trying to show him the gospel, which is God. Elihu sort of does it, but he actually relies on another technique that Job came earlier to show the gospel. I won't go into that. Elihu is trying to act as the preacher, directing Job to God, pointing him to the forces of reality, and then God appears out of the whirlwind.
Mm-hmm.
Where were you when I did this? This does this. And hey, do you know these creatures? I take care of them. Hey, you know this behemoth over here, this great creature that you can't hope to stand against? I made him the same as you.
Mm-hmm.
Look at this Leviathan, its huge destructive power. It still relies on me. The whole point of it is to look at where God is. Looking at, I made you, Job, and I take care of the entire universe. Job kind of goes, oh, okay. Well, I'm in the world that you have created, and so I will recant. I will give back this position that I've taken. But so in that aspect, God is trying to show the gospel through providence, through His presence in the creation. But I think the heart of the book is what we typically preach on Easter when it comes up in the readings, which is the Redeemer. Because when Job is trying to figure out these conflicting realities that are simultaneously acting upon him, he's trying to understand God in relation to man and suffering. So his conception, and appears 3 times in Job's speeches and then once in Elihu, is this mediator figure. You have somebody who is of God, who is of man, and communicate between the two for the resolution of suffering. And who else is this but Jesus Christ?
Mm-hmm.
This comes up chapters 9, 16, 19, and 33. We only preach on one, but it comes up 4 times. It's just the logical solution to the problem is Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
But nobody knows who he is until the incarnation.
Yeah, you're referring to the I know that my Redeemer lives part. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that my Redeemer lives, and in the end he will set his feet upon the earth.
Yeah.
Even though my flesh be destroyed, yet even though my skin be destroyed, my flesh,
yet in my flesh I will see God.
With my own eyes, and not another.
And not another. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we'd be told that that's an entirely wrong reading of the book of Job to see it as a Christocentric work in any way. But I'm with you on that.
I've read commentators. They hate that. They hate it.
I love it.
It's there. It's right there.
It's such a law gospel book.
Mm.
Yeah, it just really is.
But yeah, so before God actually speaks to us and he speaks through the law, we can only understand him, or even try to understand him, through who we can understand, which is the person of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're coming, say, in this discussion with Farrow, we're looking towards, well, how do we know God? With the exception of Kant. Everybody's getting the right answer, which is Jesus Christ. We understand God through Jesus Christ. But
yes.
And then the rest of it is kind of nuances. How do we approach Jesus Christ and revelation as it comes to us?
Well, and that was and with Job, he's such an interesting figure because he wasn't a person of the covenant, that he wasn't from the land of Israel, and so it is kind of like this. There is kind of there's revelation that's occurring here for sure, but it is kind of this idea of natural theology is sort of like implicit within it, because they and but also it shows its limits, because they try and like encounter like kind of human reason and stuff, but they get like each of them gets things wrong, each of his friends, like from their own kind of perspective, and so God has to kind of sort it out for them. But it is like sort of these but the truths that he are revealing are these things that are demonstrated in nature, which is amazing. So it's like it's kind of like there is such a brilliant intertwining between grace and nature, that they are sort of complementary, and I think that's Aquinas' point. Like, he can seem like very formulaic the way that he kind of structures things, but I think that a misreading of him would be to say that everything sort of like occurs kind of that way. I think he's trying to show operations, within, especially when he's talking about like human behavior and stuff, within sort of like this mysterious whole, and in the way that grace operates too. Like, he's trying to sort of like get to kind of the bottom of it as much as like kind of our reason can actually allow, without sort of like necessarily absolutely categorically saying this is the way it is, and so it's he kind of dissects in the end of understanding, in a more profound way, and but that's brilliant. I think that almost kind of that's almost kind of a good place to wrap up, unless you guys have some
just one
finishing comments. Yeah.
Would it be fair to say something like this? And I realize this is very reductionistic.
Sure.
But obviously, I think through philosophy or through observation of nature, we can come to know some things about God. But knowing about God is one thing. Knowing God is another. Knowing God requires his revelation to us in something more than the sense of general revelation. It needs to be that I've often heard it called general revelation versus special revelation. He reveals himself to us in Jesus Christ, in the person of Jesus Christ. It actually requires, for us to know him, it requires him coming into the creation. And that's the place of the incarnation. To observe creation is not to observe God, but to observe his handiwork. So in order to know God properly, he has to come into his handiwork. Robert Jensen, who was a great theologian, he put it this way, as by way of an analogy. He said, it's as though William Shakespeare wrote himself into one of his plays. So Hamlet, enter stage left, William Shakespeare. Hey, Hamlet, I wrote this play. Watch out, your uncle's trying to kill you. Exit stage right. Something like that. And I've always thought that's a very good way to think of it, where the author writes himself into his own story. But it does require him to come in. Like, when we are bound within the story, there's no way Hamlet could know who Shakespeare is. Right? Unless Shakespeare reveals himself. But if Hamlet could detach himself from the story and just start looking around, he might say, I can know a fair number of things about this guy based upon the way he wrote the play. I find that a good way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, I think that it's an interesting way of illustrating it too. But yeah, that the author's handprints are around, but we can't really know the author until we actually meet him, and he comes down to us, and we don't have that ability to grasp the author. It's until he becomes he comes down to us, and that's actually next week we'll probably, or 2 weeks, whatever we decide, that's kind of the point of of Anselm, and we'll talk more about salvation and justification at that time. But yeah, as far as knowing God, that's absolutely true. So why don't, so you're the since you're the most senior in ministry amongst us, Pastor Karl, why don't you lead us in an Our Father to end off?
Sure, with or without. We Lutherans outnumber you Catholics, so we'll have the doxology at the end.
You can have the doxology, but I'll make the sign of the cross, and then I'll have the last word.
Okay. Let us pray.
All right.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy
name.
Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Oh, good. We all meet the sign of the cross. It's great. We're in full communion now.
Hey, that was fun, guys.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah. So, should we? Do you want to meet in again in 2 weeks or 1 week? What's your thought?
I'd be okay to go in another week.
Oh,
I'm almost through chapter 2. I have a couple of pages left.
Okay, perfect.
This is one of those books that the highlighted passages almost outnumber the non-highlighted passages sometimes. But
right, yeah, for me too, yeah, absolutely. There's just so much to unpack, and I went through this first chapter again, and it just was like, oh, did I read this? You know, there's a lot there, yeah. But okay, well, God bless, brothers, and I will plan to meet in a week's time. And should we try and meet discuss chapter 2 or maybe 3 and 4 for next week? What's your thought with that? 3 would probably be enough, you know, if we were to do, or we could just do 1 chapter a week, you know, like
I almost think we should just do 1 chapter a week because it's arranged so topically. I'm afraid that if we start trying to get off into 2 topics at once, it just becomes a mishmash. If you guys, you know, if we're going to do it, let's do it. We got time.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. All right. So chapter 2 next week.
Okay.
All right.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. We'll see you guys later.
See you.
Take care.